What we're going to attempt to do today is to show the contrast in the economic relationship of black and white people historically. It's a very complicated story, I think, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's not so complicated. If we understand some fundamental things about the American economic structure. Now, the first attempt I made was to deal with the political evolution, or the evolution of political relationships, which one can scarcely talk about without relating to economics, I think. Politics is the handmaiden of economics. One grows out of the other depending on what your particular theory is. But it's certainly no less true of America. That for an awfully long, well, now, economics is still important. It's still the driving forces of a great deal of American life, behind the driving forces. And we know that this country evolved out of its relationship of dependency as colonies with Great Britain. But prior to that, some very definite economic patterns had been established with respect to the races of people. Let me examine, first of all, the relationship very generally of really white people to American economics. I think since the time of Jamestown, about 1607, it was not very definitive for a number of reasons. I think all people in the main, except for, well, even the indentured servants, inasmuch as the indentured servants were not chattel slavery, there was at least opportunity for sharing in the rewards of the new country. You had a collection of workers in the early America, and this is before the arrival of black people into the English-speaking area of this continent. Jamestown is a forerunner to what we call the United States of America. We know that the first people who settled this region were people who represented the crown and small farmers, and namely indentured servants, artisans, and other people. Indentured servitude was a modified type of slavery, in which one was to serve a term of years, and it varied from colony to colony from 7 to 10 years, generally, after which one could be free as the next person to exploit the full potential of his humanity. It's just that simple. Black people arrived officially in English-speaking America in about 1619. They too were bondsmen, indentured servants, served a term of years. I think we have a great deal of documentation on these several of the 20 people who landed on that Dutch man of war in 1619. Caesar and Isabella, for instance, were married. Caesar himself became the owner of an indentured servant. Black man owning, exploiting, or owning, let's say, the labor, or possessing the labor of another individual. That was indentured servitude, not owning the human personality. You can see that you evolve very gradually into this, even before we begin to talk about the racial caste system of slavery, which put black people in a fixed position economically in this country. The political definitions growing out of really economic needs, and the great problem, the greatest problem facing early America was that of resolving the question of labor, of being able to find the mass labor, that is gang labor, to work the American soil. It's plain and simple. We know that the first, as I alluded to earlier, the first people, workers here were not black. the ones in the field. The blacks very soon joined other indentured servants and worked in the field and married and suffered all of the hardships the same as other people. When in 1641, and this is the first major piece of legislation, the law was passed by the state of the colony of Massachusetts for the first time, giving some definitive meaning to slavery with respect to the caste system and the factor of race of the African and whatnot. Now we know that after that it was pretty much resolved that the African, the people from the western bulge of Africa were the solution to the problem facing the exploitation of this land. It's plain and simple. You may want to ask some questions about that, and we can go into some specifics. But the point is that black people evolved very gradually, very uncertainly, into becoming perpetual slaves, which was not finalized by the legal apparatus until 1691, when it was based on the condition of the woman. This law was passed by Virginia, and of course, although we know that the colonies were somewhat autonomous, they all had the same general cultural frame of reference, the same general social codes, so it was just like they were a unit, in effect. So it was decided that the African, of course, by law, would be the beast of burden. And this is precisely what black people were, the forerunner to the combustion engine. I mean, the only kind of power that you had, pardon?
Black power?
There are a lot of ways of looking at things. But I'm sure you know that how recent the Industrial Revolution is, and you had before the machine power only animal and human power and human skill. That was the source of labor. This is how you exploited wealth, and this was the job of black people for more than 2 centuries in this country. Now, it's very interesting with respect to what happened to white persons. That isn't to say that people, I think there's some truth to the people who talk about how they struggled and they worked hard to accomplish what they've been able to accomplish. But let me show you, you had accident or no, people had a hell of a lot of help from the government, from the institutional life of this country, being able to rise to such eminence in such a short period of time. Because we know that all of the people who came to America were commoners. All of them. Folks who got on the Mayflower wasn't making it over there. That ought to be very clear to anybody. This is I think the freest man in the history of the world is the people who lived in America and who were protected by the institutional life of this country, primarily the political and economic institutions who were the dominant and still are institutions. The industrial military complex has always been here, who are still the dominant institutions in this country, and all other institutions follow. That was from the very earliest times. And so we had a pattern of economic relationships already established before 1787, before the United States of America was founded. And black people were very well grounded in the economics of this country. They were indeed the basis of the economic life of the country to a large extent, to a very large extent. And that is to say that despite the fact that most people think about slavery being confined to one general region, and I might in a physical sense that's true, but this was a national institution. It's a national institution. We make that crystal clear. It not only stimulated industry, the textile industry in this country, but the Industrial Revolution abroad. White people graduated very uncertainly into free people, that is the commoner. We can see this being resolved with the really first article in the American Constitution. It has everything that's political, but it has everything to do with economics when you talk about proportional representation in the lower house, about how people are to be counted in the population, adding to the whole number of free white persons, excluding those bound to terms of servants, excluding Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. That has profound economics positions because it defines the relationship of people to the country. And we can see from the very onset that black people were not a part of the definition of the destiny of what America was to become, not a part of that definition. Other people at least were to get the opportunity. I don't mean to say that people, the commoner, of course some of us might know of what some of the founding fathers thought about the common people, particularly people like Alexander Hamilton. He wasn't too democratic about his feelings about the common man, and many other founding fathers, to the extent that they didn't trust him. Number one, he didn't have the vote, and even some colonies, religious qualifications were necessary for people to vote. The vote didn't come to the mass of white people in this country until after the Civil War, that is in the South, where they still related voting rights to property rights. And that's very interesting. And also, one must remember that the driving force behind the Constitutional Convention were who? The business community, primarily, who were for a strong central government. That's an interesting piece of irony. The big business is anti-big government, and they were primarily responsible for it. Big government, the strong central government. Other people were opposed to it. And there are reasons, obviously, for this. The Great Compromise worked out between these two factions. There were seeds of the Industrial Revolution already in the North, and the agrarian economy of the South was very well entrenched as a social institution, as a social structure. So you had two developing economies. One very soon to become an industrialized nation in a matter of 50, 60 years, another bound by its culture, really, which determined almost everything, bound by its culture to a slavocracy. So what you really had was two economies. And in the Constitutional Convention, the seeds of the Civil War were very well planted. The first great compromise had to do, of course, with the slaves, of being counted as, make sure that they were counted as property and make sure that the central government protect the property of the slaveholding class. $10 tax head is what they got out of it. Jefferson got out of that a promise that the slave trade would be outlawed in 1807, which never happened. And it really stopped secession. South Carolina and Georgia and Mississippi threatened to walk out if they even, talk seriously about the abolition of slavery. So that was the first great compromise. We know after America was founded, I think this is when, and particularly after Jeffersonian democracy, we have the great equalitarian spirit developing for the common people, the westward movement, people moving further away from the central government. You had what would be tantamount to really land reforms, without spelling it out. That there was plenty land here for people to go to, and if they had any gumption about doing anything for themselves, they were able to do it. They were protected by white people moved all over this country. Black people, for a long time, it even determines the migration patterns of black people, is what happened back there. It's no mystery why the great majority of black folks were confined to 17 states in this country. That was legal. That isn't to say they weren't smattering all over the country, west. But whites had the opportunity to move throughout this nation and exploit their abilities. The west, after the crossing of the Mississippi, we have the development of the great agrarian economy, and which eventually evolved into the great industrial belt of the country. And you see, people were a part of the definition. That's very important. There was a protection from government for individual rights, for economic rights. We know that eventually this didn't work. We're talking about, and let me point this out, I think there are two kinds of Americans. There's a new American. I don't know who is hyphenated, but I think the southern person is an old American, and also people in the eastern seaboard states, namely New England area. These are the oldest, the Anglo-Saxon oldest American. But the people who came, who immigrants to a country which was already established, are the new Americans, and these are the people who were certainly were able to take advantage of the new opportunities of this nation. We know that the country eventually solved the dispute, the economic question of agrarian versus industrial society with the Civil War. That's what it was all about as far as the official government was concerned, this rebellion, the War of the Rebellion. And so the Civil War split the country for 4 years in a bloody war, and after which You had reunification. This was tantamount to a revolution in that you had a reordering of things. The South was like a conquered nation. And the captains of industry were concerned about unification to develop their railroad and complete the concept of manifest destiny. That was really at the election of 1876 is a widely known fact which related to this, to economics. The election of Rutherford B. Hayes, who actually didn't even win the popular vote, but he became president because of his promise to leave hands off the South and let the counter-revolution win. We know that the labor movement began in earnest after the Civil War. The labor movement that we know began in about 1882. The AFL, the first, which is still with us, Samuel Gompers and these people, who organized. And this is the way the white people who were exploited by capitalists solved their question to share in the rewards, is that they organized the labor movement to get their just due from their labor. That makes sense, I think, to anybody. And consequently, they were able to share in America's greatest wealth, that is the industrial expansion. The greatest growth in American history, percentage-wise, took place during the last 2 decades of the 19th century, from about 1880 to 1900, when they were producing jobs, creating jobs faster than they could find people to fill. And many people, nearly 400,000 people, came to this country to fit in again into the definition of the industrial complex. And labor organized to solve the question for the common man. It wasn't ultimately solved until 1935, when labor was finally taken off the subversive list. It was, of course, a conspiracy, communist conspiracy, up until 1935, the Wagner Act. That's just yesterday, that ain't a century ago. And we know this is how white people solve their problems, because they were, again, able to organize and move as a collective group based on self-interest to fight the capitalists. It's plain and simple. I mean, let's not get hung up on capitalists necessarily being racist. They're exploiters. And certainly white people were exploited by capitalists too, but they certainly were not as vulnerable as black people. They had some protection, common culture, common background, common heritage. All of these psychological and sociological factors gave some protection to white folks in the American economy. And consequently, they were able to evolve and develop with its growth and its expansion, from the agrarian economy to the industrial urban complexes, and now to the space age. This is how this economy has grown. They were able to enjoy the rights of education, which is directly related to the economy, of course. All of these things are extension of America's politics to this very day. So it's really no mystery to a lot of us how this happened. Now let us examine the relationship of black people who came here as bond servants, who evolved into perpetual slavery, the basis of the economy for a lot of years. About 60% of what we call a GNP right now came out of the labor of black people. And let us really understand something about the elements which go into making economics, whatever economics, what it is. You must have land, labor, and resource, creation, distribution, and consumption of wealth, the basic elements of economics, and the basic source of all economics is labor. That was black people for 84 years of the first 84 years of the United States existence. People were confined to a region. They were the basis of the first great economic industries, beginning with the sugar industry, later indigo, tobacco, and finally King Cotton, which was international industry. I mean, the whole of the Western world benefited from the textile industry and many other things that the slave labor stimulated. So they certainly were making only for forced contribution, a very significant one, to the development of the wealth of the nation state. And while all this was going on, let us examine some of the protective measures taken to protect this machinery, this slavery. For almost the whole of the 19th century prior to the Civil War, the only issue that this country faced in terms of a domestic issue was that of the question of slave labor, of the great compromises of 1820, of 1850, of 1854, and one could go on, and these are some of the major compromise. One of the great ones that passed by the federal government was the Compromise of 1850, when California was allowed to come into the state. And one of the things that she had agreed to, that she would accept the concept of the fugitive slave law. That is, that the government would protect the property rights of the slaveholding class in the South by offering the $10 for capture of black people who escaped. See, it's very clear. So this is a public law. It's not state, it's national. And slavery was indeed a national institution. The greatest slave trading state was not Mississippi, it was Massachusetts. That ought to be crystal clear. The people who brought the black people into this country were the New England states, that is, who were directly linked to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and who were indeed a part of the triangular trade system with the molasses, rum, and slave and this business. And eventually sold almost all of the slaves to the South, to the slave-breeding South. So it was a national institution, although most of the people were in the South. Black people were, as I said, slaves for 84 years as the United States of America, after this country became the United States of America. Now, after the Civil War, let us see what happened to black people. Let me say this before, parenthetically, that the largest artisan class, and perhaps the first artisan class in this country, were black people. We ought to make that crystal clear. I'd like to read an excerpt from something I picked up in many statements made by Frederick Douglass with respect to this. Now get this. It's a statement made about Frederick Douglass, and he's largely addressing himself really to the free population. And that's a very unbelievable word to use, but there are a classification of black people who were called freedmen. That meant that they were recognized as free people by law. It doesn't mean really that they were free. They had manumission papers, freedom papers, which meant that they weren't property. Douglass said, and the old avocations by which colored men obtain a livelihood are rapidly, increasingly, and inevitably passing into other hands. Every hour sees the black man elbowed out of employment. White men are becoming house servants, cooks, and stewards on vessels at hotels. They are becoming porters, stevedores, wood saws, hod carriers, brickmakers, whitewashers, and barbers, so that the blacks can scarcely find the means of subsistence a few years ago. And a white barber would have, so the blacks could scarcely find the means of subsistence a few years ago. And a white barber would have been a curiosity. Now their poles stand on every street. Formerly, blacks were almost the exclusive coachmen in wealthy families. This is no longer the case. White men are now employed, and what we see, they fill their civil positions with an obsequiousness as profound as that of the blacks. The readiness and ease with which they adapt themselves to these conditions ought not to be lost sight of by the colored people. The meaning is very important, and we should learn it. We are taught our insecurity by it. Without the means of a living, life is a curse and leaves us at the mercy of the oppressor to become his debased slave. Now, colored men, what do you mean to do? For you must do something. One thing is certain. We must find new methods of obtaining a livelihood, for the old ones are failing us fast. This was written in 1853. It already started. The increase. What I'm saying, the servant class is historically black, and the service professions, certainly in the crafts and the whole business of brick masons and whatnot, in the South, the largest block of these kind of workers were black people. In shipbuilding, Douglass made another statement some years ago with respect to black people involved in the American economy, involved in life, when he said that the present is enough to prove the equal manhood of black people. Is it not astonishing that while we're reaping, plowing, sowing, while we're working in metals of iron, brass, silver, copper, and gold, while we're reading, writing, and ciphering, while we are having among us ministers, doctors, lawyers, school teachers, artisans, poets, and teachers, while we are engaged in all the pursuits common to other men, capturing the whale in the Pacific, digging the gold into California, herding the sheep and the cattle on the hillside, living, acting, thinking, breathing human beings, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping a Christian God, we are constantly called upon to prove that we are men. He was giving a description. This again was over before the Civil War, of what black people were engaged in. See what they were engaged in. James Weldon Johnson, after the Civil War, this is a black man, one of our great philosophers and poets, who grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, before the turn of the century. He died in the early part of the century. And he wrote in a classic work called Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, said that when he was a boy growing up in Charleston, he didn't know there was a white man anywhere in this country who could build a boat or a house, who could lay a brick, because all of them that he saw were black. That's true. And Dr. Arthur Ross, who is now with the Department of Labor in Washington, D.C., did a study, and he pointed out that 4 out of every 5 artisans of the South before the Civil War were black people. Over 100,000 of them, engaged in every skill that you could name. That's a fact, you see. Now what happened, see, after the Civil War, this is very crucial. People talk about things don't change overnight. They do change. Black people's stations change overnight 2 times, just overnight, in a matter of 2-3 decades. After the Civil War, I said the Industrial Revolution began in earnest, the labor movement began in earnest. Black people who were once fully employed became a problem in employment, see, because you had to pay them this time. And that was the problem. You had the Freedmen's Bureau to solve the labor disputes. People that still didn't want to pay black folks. And what happened, of course, the slavery was replaced with a modified condition of slavery called a sharecropping system. That's what I'm a descendant of. This is my grandparents in South Carolina. This is what they were, sharecroppers. That you work year-round for the man and you pay him. But that you pay him. You just every time you end up paying him. And we stayed in that condition for almost 50 years, most black people. Stayed in that condition for 50 years. It's interesting, that they were, certainly the black people were involved in the labor movement from its earliest years. They tried, and there were some minor unions who made efforts to integrate the labor movement. That is very true. Even the AFL, but they gave up when they finally organized. And one of the first things that the organized labor did was to draw up racial exclusion clauses in their documents. It's the first private organization to have practiced racial exclusion. And that's the common man. That's the racist culture in the country. The people can't help that. But it has to be, just like the church, just like the government, just like the schools, just like everything else. Labor, if you can imagine that. And that was probably the salvation of black people, would have been the labor movement. They tried an awfully long time to get in, well, still are, get in the labor movement. And then we have to consider, unlike the Westward Movement and the Homestead Act and whatnot, black people didn't benefit from that. There were no economic reforms after the Civil War. It was purely the same thing we're dealing with now, civil rights. There were no economic and social reforms. Now, we know that Thaddeus Stevens offered the concept of 40 acres and a mule to every stable black family. Mule and tools. Because he realized that these people who had been bound to the soil for over 300 years, and you give them tools, and they could make it. See, but there were no land reform. This country is unique among all the ex-slaveocracies in the world who didn't, even Russia, who freed their slaves in 1888, long after America, had land reforms for her slaves. We talk about these crazy countries. But they did that much. There has never been any economic reform, and that is the problem facing black people right now economically, is a question of land. It's always been a problem. So what we have, and of course this was perhaps the bitterest period in the economically and otherwise, the country for black people in America's history, those 35 years after the Civil War, we call it the nadir period, the lowest point in the history of black people. We almost disappeared from the face of the earth. The few gains that were made through civil rights were almost reversed in a matter of 15 years. We know this is Reconstruction. In 15 years, it almost disappeared. The counter-revolution, not only through fraud, violence, intimidation, the obvious things, murder, but the government, including the Supreme Court, changed courses and began reactionary, reversed many decisions. Civil Rights Act of 1875 was repealed, and finally the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896. So black people were really out of it. We were worse off in terms of being involved in purposeful work after the Civil War. And black people were still able to control the catering industry in New York for as late as the 1890s. You can't go to New York now and find one restaurant downtown. They control it. That's the tradition of black people, and one of the contributions that black people have made to America has been in the area of the culinary arts, that is cooking. the food that you call Southern cooking, and which black people now call soul food, is a black art. You see, and wherever black people went, they did that. They cooked the food for the bourbon class. You know, they haven't stopped yet. That's who cook Southern cooking. And yet you can go any place. This is economic. You know, everybody likes to eat. And there's no culinary art celebrated among black people comparable to, say, a pizza. Comparable to the thing that Swedish people have that I love so much. With all the food on smorgasbord. Well, you know. Well, it's very definitely black. You know, I mean, in terms of America's foods, which you call Southern cooking. The people who cooked it were black people. My mother labored slave in the kitchen for 30 years. You know, genius. You know, at creating new types of food. But that's good economics, and they got them out of that in New York by the turn of the century. Weren't even. Not only that, if you can talk about, we talk about the wealthy blacks in the sports world now. You know, the Lou Alcindors and other people. There's nothing new about that. Like the first, I think, great athletes in this country among black people, I mean, a collection of them were jockeys. See, that's very interesting. Jockeys. I mean, people like Isaac Murphy, Jimmy Isaac Murphy was the first Triple Crown winner, and they dominated the racing field for 25 years. The first winner of the Kentucky Derby in 1875 was Oliver Lewis, aboard of Stratus, and of the 22 riders in there, 14 of them were black. They dominated. They won most of the major races. Now, why don't you see any black jockeys? There are 2 black jockeys in the country today. That seems strange. When before the turn of the century, the very opposite was true. You know. Now, we know that that's the sport of kings. And we also know that a jive jockey makes $250,000 a year. Just jiving, you know, just so yeah. If he's a top flight jockey, that's the richest athlete in the world, and that was just too much money for black folks to have, Jimmy Wakefield and Isaac Murphy. So you don't have anything but the groomers. The last black man that ran the Kentucky Derby was in 1903. There hasn't been one abroad since. Got them all off the horses. That's economics too, you know. When we began to, expand more and more and talking about what we eventually evolved into out of the machine age into automation, if you look at what happened in the railroad industry, now you see black people being porters on the train, and that's like almost a conventional accessory. It's almost as if it's by nature that he's supposed to be the porter. But that ain't always been true. Working almost at fireman, switchman, brakeman. But as soon as these jobs were modernized, you see jobs came along racially and they became white jobs. That is when it became no longer, the supermasculine menial, that is the black man, where it called for all muscle and this kind of stuff. It disappeared when the button came. And black people have lost many jobs. And the railroad industry is a classic example, one of its greatest employers of black people historically. And you can point out many areas, and certainly in brick masonry, and the stevedores, shipbuilding. I had to fight to get back in shipbuilding during World War II. Executive Order 8802, that's FEPC, to be able to work in the shipping industry. Well, we're already in the shipping industry over 100 years ago. Now, how did this happen? You see, we're talking about, economics. We're talking about the economic life of white people being protected by the government. You cannot divorce economics from politics. One is, it's an impossibility. Politics gives a definition of the economic life of the country. It isn't so much that we were lazy. That's right. Incidentally, black folks didn't become lazy until after the Civil War. That's mythical. That wasn't an antebellum South myth. He worked like a nigger. That's an old slave expression, meaning he worked, like dog, 18 hours a day. Whereas 3 Irishmen and 4 Indians, 2 Scots. This is the way he used to compare. That's the forerunner to the combustion Indian. Then you start to see, then he got lazy. After the Civil War, the vagrancy laws and whatnot were passed. They said that if you were out of work after the Civil War, then it's very interesting. Didn't have $50. Most people didn't even see $50. Never even seen $50. Then you could be picked up on vagrancy and hired out. Picked up. That's the chain gang. Also was a modified condition of slavery. You had the chain gang after the Civil War. That's all it was. To build the roads to the South. That's who built them. Chain gang through Georgia and Mississippi and whatnot. So black people have always been exploited, and I think that really they've done enough work, and I'm serious about that in economics. I hear white folks, talk a lot about the work, the reverence for work, and this kind of jazz. I don't think black people should buy that myth, and that is what I'm saying. I'm not opposed to people working, but I don't think they should buy that. Because that didn't work for them. The whole concept. I think they worked as hard, if not harder, than anybody in this country. Just talking about, and we know it's got something more to do with the Protestant ethic, working hard, and you lived a good life. And it is just a bunch of nonsense for black people. It's all right for white people to believe that, but not. And it's absurd to talk about raising oneself by one's bootstrap, when in fact you have a totally new economic, an extension of economics, which creates a totally new environment. In this day and age, we live almost in a technological age. When most people came to this country, they talk about how they work and how they made it in one generation. Most of the jobs were unskilled or semi-skilled jobs. The kind of job that we're talking about now hadn't been around no more than 20 years. Automation and now cybernetics. And it's folly to ask somebody from a Mississippi sharecropper to run a computer. It's insane, It's a totally different environment. His background is agrarian and whatnot, and it's too much for him to overcome. And people are asking these people, why can't you cope with the situation? Maybe it's because they coped with the situation for 300 years. They coped with it then when it was hard work, and they weren't a part of the evolution of American economics. That's all. So to say you reverent, for work is not saying very much to me. To tell people that. I feel that if you're serious about that, you ought to pay the people some reparation, for the work they already did. And pay them then, back dues. and then we can talk about working hard some more. But I wouldn't dare encourage anybody to go out and work for $40, $45 a week. That is insane. I think you should do anything rather than do that. Because we've done that, for years, for nothing. Nearly 300 years in chattel slavery, another half century in the tenant farming sharecropping system, another half century, includes this one, in the whole process of massive social disorganization in the semi-skilled and unskilled jobs in industry and the steel plants in Gary and Chicago and all, and now that's disappeared. And you're never able to evolve and develop with the job. You don't develop with the creation of new jobs. Black people, they're always involved in dying trades. People are being trained now in dying skills that will be no good in the next 2 or 3 years. And they're going to school. For some people, going to vocational school for stuff like that. And people should be told if you're serious, they have to start where the action is. And not tell people that I should work for $40 a week like they did. What can you do with $40 a week when they tell us that in order to be able to make it in this country, the family of 4 in any urban center has to be cutting at about $9,300 a year just to get along. And you're going to tell somebody to work for $40 a week with 3 children. Listen, if you find any other way to make it, I can certainly understand that. And if that's criminal behavior, then it's also criminal behavior, on the part of people who force this condition. I think we got to talk about things, like values, human values, and the worth of the human personality, and what the human purpose is all about. You can't indict people for not working, because they have worked. They made a tremendous contribution, way beyond their numbers to this country, in terms of the wealth of the nation state on the whole, its economy, see. Now, one should say something about economics. And this we're talking about racism. When am I supposed to stop?
Whenever you feel it natural.
When is the?
We have until 5, counting the question.
Okay. See, if you understand, if social mobility in America, everybody talks about social mobility. This is a classless, casteless society. Well, I'm not sure it's classless, but we're about it. Social mobility in this country is almost a direct outgrowth of economics. Almost a direct. When you talk about people in higher, better homes, better education, there's a direct relationship to economics. You don't have any any real class structure like birthrights in old Europe here. And see, that hasn't been a possibility for black people, a reality, in any serious way, where you make the jump in one generation. So what happens if you can't make it economically in this country, you're not going to make it in terms of education, in terms of, the housing and all these other things. One relates to the other. So it is nonsense to hear people dichotomize things like housing and jobs and education. It's all part and parcel of the same thing, the same scheme of things. You can't divorce the one from the other. If you don't make no money, to make a dollar is a peculiar American expression. No other people could have created that phrase, make money. If you don't make money in this country, and this is a big hang-up for black people, have not been able to make money. That is the central problem. As a group, okay? You said people cite all these exceptional black people, like the first millionaire in this country, female ever to earn $1 million on her own was a black woman, Madam Walker, the cosmetologist. I mean, you cite, see, but Madam Walker don't get it. I mean, people can't take comfort in you saying the first black woman, first woman in America ever to earn $1 million on her own was black. That ain't got nothing to do with the mass of the people, who are unskilled and doesn't have that genius. This was a country which was created for the benefit of the common man. If you had a strong back and a weak mind, you could make it. You could make it up until 30 years ago. And I'm living testimony to that. My father, anyway, whom I think is a very successful man, considering his background and whatnot. And, acquired 3 trades, never went to school a day in his life or anything. Made a whole lot of money. That's right. He came up during the Depression. Will make more money than I will ever make, and has nothing resembling what they call education. You can see it among our own people. There's some people in the trades and whatnot. Now, if I try to be what he is, brick mason, barber, automobile mechanic, all these things, I'd have to go to school, see, and I won't be qualified because I can't pass the CUDA, whatever it is, the intelligence test, today, to get on a semi-skilled job, a job that really had no relationship to skills. Really don't have any relationship, but you got to take what they call a cultural test. That's all it is, an intelligence test. To get a job now that almost shines shoes. That's how ridiculous it's gotten. See, and they didn't do, like I'm all for that. You see, if people in the labor union say, well, you're not qualified. Well, they didn't take these examinations. These people over 50 years old, and I'd like to see these people who drive automobiles. Who never went to the. Let's make it fair and square. If you talking about qualifications, now black people have all these new barriers to overcome, for which they are not prepared to deal with. But some of these things are more than 10 or 15 years old, the qualifications that they place on people. It's another form of discrimination, no matter what you call it. People can be honest about it, but it grows directly out of racism. It's not acknowledging the innate and pervasive negative aspects of racism in the culture. And that means it's in every institution, it's represented in every lifestyle. And there's no way you can go where you will not run into racism. Black people are affected by racism where you would think it ain't got nothing to do with racism. See, when I examine people like the Masons, the Elks, this all black units like that, it seems on the surface that is not why they're all black Masons and Elks. It's the result of racism. That's a reaction to racism. And it looks on the surface like it has nothing to do with it. And it goes to ridiculous extremes. So I think that, this is a country which measures a man by the dollar. I think that's unfortunate, but it's a reality that has to be dealt with, that people are measured by the amount of money that they could make, and I would assume that this is quite possibly why black people will not be able to gain their dignity as human beings until this is a fact. So long as it's a value, you either change your mind about what to value, or you have to accept a dominant value. This is the crucial thing. As long as money and whatnot is a central thing in American life, black people ain't going to have it. You can bet that. As a group, they're not going to have it. So what it calls for is a legitimate recognition of the cultural realities in the society, and understanding human values. that it is maybe not even necessary, but not even desirable for people to aspire to want to be the head of General Motors, which is something else again. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't want to be head of General Motors, but I think people have to, that is not a reality, maybe, to deal for, and in a humane way, because I think the traumas are too great for people. I know I have scanned very briefly how I see this economic structure. And I just drew some symbols of it to show you how I think the structure of the two societies, biracial societies, is established. This represents the white, of course, is a diamond shape. At the top of the diamond, you have of course, the plutocrats or the super elites, the very rich, the wealthy, the old wealth, the mass of the people, the bulk of the people in the middle. That's middle class America. 75 to 80% of the people who live better than the pharaohs of Egypt, better than Caesars of Rome. That's America. And a minority at the bottom who are poverty-ridden in the sense that black people are. That's different. Black people have a very tiny minority of people who are well-to-do. And the overall majority, you're talking about 85%, are at the base of the pyramid. That's the way the economic structure is, and that's the way it's always been. That's the way it is today. And that's the way it's going to remain, short of a revolution. It will not change. People will not raise themselves by their bootstraps. You see, if I accepted that, I would indeed think that black people were superior. And I don't believe that. See, I don't believe that they're superior. That's a superior. I don't believe they're Superman. They cannot raise themselves up by their bootstraps. That's in them as a group. They cannot enjoy social mobility, the mass of black people like white people. I think that's an impossibility in a closed economy. I don't think that's possible to do that, unless there's some tremendous reorientation in the distribution of the wealth of this country. It's simple. I think my answer to anybody is reparation. There's nothing wrong with reparation. That's a civilized way that people have always solved this question. Reparation is defined by international law as repayment for crimes committed against one's ancestors. That's the way it was solved in Germany. That's the way it's been solved in many people who have been ravaged. And no other way to deal with it. Is you got to recognize that reality. Black people are not going to raise themselves by their bootstraps unless they are superhuman. And I don't believe there are any superhumans, whether they're black or white or yellow. There are no superhumans. I know it's hard to convince some people that, that isn't true. I think we all have these human frailties, and I just don't see that. So why don't I stop and entertain some questions from
I'd like to, you emphasize all the way through human values, and that the values we have affirmed have been materialistic, and necessarily you shouldn't strive for these values. How do you relate this new movement toward black business, black capital, black investment, to what you are saying here? How do you evaluate
Well, I don't think, first of all, black capitalism as such, if I understand it, and maybe I don't understand what capitalism is and what Mr. Nixon is talking about, but I don't think it can begin to work unless it has some cultural frame of reference. Black people. I don't think anything can work among black people in any massive way until there's some legitimation of their culture. I don't think it's possible for anything. See, culture, everything flows from culture, the way I see it. I mean, your discipline, your values of your behavior pattern, everything. And it must be something that you could link into, something that's real to you. Now, capitalism is far removed from us. There's a concept. We are victims of capitalism, historically and contemporarily. I mean, strike breakers in modern times, you see. So I don't see, unless they can work out, unless there's some recognition of valid black culture, and people begin to evolve things and concepts and whatever economics out of their cultural frame of reference. And it doesn't have to be any conceptualized view. You can develop the economics as you go along. But if you're talking about traditional primitive capitalism, I think that's the worst thing that could happen to black people.
How does the community feel about the new bank on Plymouth Avenue?
I have no idea. I'm sure it's no big thing. People can't really, so it's a cultural factor. I don't think I'm sure some of us do relate to it. We know the importance of it. But I don't think the average person is just dying to put his money in there. I have that tradition. That's not in our culture, you see. And that's what anything that I think that if this country is serious, I mean, the government, They must understand the cultural background of black people. See, that's just the end of it. If you don't recognize this culture, then you're going to create more and more and more problems. Trying to do it from a frame of reference from a bird's eye view instead of a frog's eye view. Yes.
What is your opinion then of the guaranteed annual wage?
And insofar as I understand it, I think that's one way of dealing with the negative income tax and whatnot. Sure, it's the way this country. Look, it bothers me to even talk about it. America's wealth. It just astounds me. When they talk about an $800 billion gross national product, $800 billion, nearly $1 trillion. Can you imagine that? I can't. I've been told that just $1 billion. To give you some idea of what $1 billion is, you could lay a dollar end to end and it'd stretch around the world almost 2.5 times. $1 billion. That's we got 800 of that. You could spend, invest $1 billion in a bank, and you'd draw $75 interest a week, $75,000 interest a week, and you could live 1,344 years, never spend it all, spending $1,000 a day, never touch it. Just $1 billion, and you got 800 of that in this country. That's exactly half of all the goods and services in the world. 50% of all the wealth in the world. You see, because the economic sphere of this country includes Africa, Europe, and the two Americas. It has been. That's the direct legacy of colonialism and slavery, the same economic sphere. 50% of all the wealth in the world. I'm told that a state like California outproduced the whole of the economy of Red China last year. China had an $80 billion budget. California had an $85 billion budget. A state like Ohio outproduced the whole of the continent of Africa, including South Africa. And the 11 eastern seaboard states, just picked them, outproduced all of the Soviet Union. All of the Soviet Union. And our beloved defense budget, $78.1 billion, is more than the total economy of all the countries of Latin America, from New Mexico to Chile, including the West Indies. You got that much, and then you have the contradictions you'd see in the society of we rank very high in infant mortality rate, death about number 9, number 1 in medical research though. That's very interesting. In healthcare, we rank number 13. That's very poor for America, way down the list. A country like that, it shows the distorted values, And there's, this country's got enough wealth, to feed half the world, and yet we got children starving in Mississippi. That's racism. I saw them down there. The only reason they're starving because of institutionalized racism. I mean, just like the children in Biafra, with the distended stomach, and in India. Same. The only reason why they're starving is because their parents voted, something like that, or practiced democracy. And all these contradictions, I think people are able to live with. All of this wealth. I think John Kenneth Galbraith was quite right when he said the movers and shakers of America do not understand the wealth of this country. It's something like Machiavelli. He says the most dangerous threats to democracy are greedy and incompetent and ignorant politicians. And I think we have more than our share. I think he was right. Although most of them read Machiavelli, they don't know what he said about them. The greedy politicians. But that's who, these people have harnessed all of this wealth as if it were theirs, as if nobody else made any contributions, you see. And that's really what it's going to boil down to in this country, not because I'm saying so. I mean that you probably will have something resembling a war, man, because it's too obvious to people. It is so obvious. They're going around playing like the Roman Empire, bread and circuses for the people, the poverty program, so they won't be aware of their misery. That's the same old thing. There's no need, as Galbraith said, for this to be. The fact of the matter is that poverty could be erased tomorrow. I mean, physical poverty. That the values we adhere to have nothing to do with the human condition at this point in our lives. It's a value system relates to a time of pestilence, poverty, disease. That's not true anymore. Okay, for most Americans, that's just not true. And you can't do that to people with all due respect to history in the past, and say, look, you got to go back by people's daddy and do what I did in order for you to be a valid man. Before you drive a 69 car, drive a Model T Ford, then you be, that's absurd, crude. And this is what people are asking their children, to live exactly as I did, adhere to the same value system, do not acknowledge any of the environmental changes, all of the influences that you grew up under. They're not valid. Only my value orientation is real and has a background. You must think and act the same way I did back on the farm during the grading. You must think and act the same way I did in the crummy tenement that I lived in the East Side or in central Cleveland. That is not fair, because that is no longer a reality. So this question is not to ask the people the present to adjust, you ask the past to adjust. That's the central problem, and I don't think people can do that. And so, to continue to have poverty-stricken people in a country like this I think is a crime. I mean, people are hungry. I don't think anybody should be given everything. But I certainly don't think that if you're a civilization, and this is what civilization, I don't care how many buildings you got. I heard once Sir Harry Johnson point out that civilization for him was to be able to make those who are even unfit for society fit to live in it. That's the meaning of civilization to him. And, we're not willing to do that, to just feed people. They say, okay, you're hungry, man. You don't have to work to eat. You don't have a job, okay. You still have a right to eat. You're human. You're my brother. You're a human being. You have a beating heart. You have living affections. But the value system said no. So you got to be a man. You got to shine shoes. Like I shine shoes. I'm the last generation do that. Carried papers, worked in the chicken plucking house, the whole ball of wax. That is not a reality for me to ask my son. The fact of the matter is there may be some machines to do it. Well, I know about the chicken plucking house because that went out when I was coming along. It put me out of a job. And I was a good chicken plucker. That's no longer a reality. So he has to be in tune with his environment. What is, not what ought to be, and that economic trouble is a troublesome problem for this country. Then we got the question of the country's, the control of a whole economic sphere that people don't relate to, like the things we use every day. It's a reason why some of these people are so poor in some of these backward countries. You ought to read The Rich Nations and the Poor Nations by Barbara Ward. And, like that's what happened. When modern economics grew up, it was a world economy. It's a world economy, worldwide in scope and in nature. The wealth of Africa, we enjoy it right here in America. Got on something right now from Africa. Something in this room is made from some substance from Africa. Nothing you can point to that you look at every day. We don't tend to see that relationship, And the way they have defined economics is that it's all through the superheroics of the all-American boy. That myth has to be destroyed. My grandfather was an all-American boy, I guess. And if we don't deal with, wealth, I think, number one, I think that it's more than just a local problem. A continental problem. I think it's international. And I think that, the whole third world movement is predicated on that. The whole idea is to regain some of the land and resources. See, another problem with black people, you're talking about economics. People, everything you see just about, I think, is defined superficially. When you talk about open housing, what do you mean? Really, open housing is moving where white people are. I think that's what it turns out to mean. But it don't have to mean that. We could just talk about space. And that's just space. That's where just space to live. That is the problem for black people, not open housing. Need space. This country uses 13% of the land. 13% of the land. Most of it is unused. You can imagine how much black people live on there. In Harlem, there are 300,000 people living in 3.5 square miles. In west side Chicago, 43% of the people live in about 3 square miles. These are black people. See, it's a space problem. And people say, well, these are slums. You see, these are not slums. There has never been any slums like this when the immigrant. There's never been that kind of population density. That is not true. There ain't never been that many Irishmen or that many Poles. That's different. These are we don't know what. Medinas, call them anything. Casbahs, but they're not slums. This is a whole new thing when you got people living in, my God, 100 people in half an acre, just square foot. Population density is a problem. And as long as you have people living on top of one another, you're going to have what you call slums. There just ain't no space. There is space. But black people don't have land use. That is the use of the land. See, that's very crucial. That's another economic factor. And then, with respect, even if you had open housing, all these years we still had a problem because FHA had some very interesting regulations, which were just disappeared here about 2 years ago. It was very hard. It's easy for you to get through the eye of a needle and get a loan from FHA, even if you were a veteran. That's just 2 years ago. And you hear these nice and clean-cut and pristine white people who live in the suburbs who were subsidized $30 billion. That's what they paid for them houses, largely financed by FHA, all the moderate income houses in this country. Now that's subsidy. Do something for black people, it's called welfare. See? Word game. Same, we come from the same source, the government helped them. But that's subsidy. They were able to get a loan and buy these homes after World War II when the burgeoning middle class came into being. So that's the word game, the symbol, the welfare and subsidy. What is the difference? That's government assistance, that's government help. And they spent more money on the middle class than they certainly ever will spend on poor people. $30 billion, that's what it's gone into. Homes for white people. And again, it's economics. That's the definition and the destiny of what America is. And black people are outside of that context. That's just plain and simple. And I think as long as you have the definition, as long as you have philosophical racism in this country, this problem will be with us until institutional racism disappears. You can forget it. This will be here. And I think at this point, I think in terms of economics, not so much talking about capitalism, but I think I'm not hung up too much on ideology. You see, I don't care. I've learned something that you can build your ideology as you go along, your ideas and whatnot. So I'm not too hung up on conceptualized ideologies, but I believe that there are ways that black people could develop economy. It would be very beneficial to them as a group. And that is through cooperative communalism concept. Well, some people have already done this in places like Georgia and Mississippi. That's what the point is. What is your relationship to wealth? That's what man has to find. Who is it for? Are you to use wealth or it to use you? That's a human value. You have to deal with that. Am I going to use things? Or love things and use people, or should it be vice versa? Should I love people and use things? These are basic values that people are going to have to confront themselves with. I think black people are in a position to do that. Basically because we still live out of basic needs. Most of what we do is out of necessity. And we're still basically trying to satisfy needs, not trying to gratify wishes. That grows really out of your life. And it's important, for instance, that all children, if you got some money, that they should be able to eat. If you got, that's just it. It has to be that kind of a value. They just have to have something to eat, whether or not his dad is working, to make sure that child has some food in his mouth. And that's the kind of and I think this can work. It doesn't have to be capitalism. I'm not for naming things. I just do, because you name something, hey, oh boy. That whole bit was communist inspired and stuff. That's the other boogeyman. But you got to deal with that. everything is communism. Um, I don't know what it was before communism. It was telling people what to do. But it's always some outside force telling people that they're being exploited, that they're being degraded socially, that they're being oppressed. Yes.
Mr. Williams, your statistics are very interesting, and especially when you're talking about the gross national product and the amount of interest that an ordinary human being pays to the establishment throughout his life. These kind of statistics are fine. The fact is, we all know what they are. We've learned them through our history books, our economics books, our sociology books, and so on. Despite the fact that the establishment knows that we know these things, the establishment is still very sure that we aren't going to do anything about this.
Right.
That we sit and take it and never make any kind of question about this. How do you explain this acceptance by the great majority, the 85% of, let's say, we'll put this in white terms, the kind of acceptance and apathy that we allow this to happen?
Values. The value system of the country that is started, values. And I think since, this value system is a system out of which the country grew. And of course, it's a success. You don't argue with success. And to many people, I think the great mass of white people, this is the end of all progress, the materialistic world. Now, I don't think it's an impossibility that people will be able to awaken and react. As a matter of fact, I can see seeds of that already. I'm not talking about a great number of people. But I think everybody, you're right, everybody knows this. That's quite true. But people are creatures of habit, and we are conditioned, with respect to the things that shaped us in growing up and developing and this kind of thing. So I think that it's going to be a monumental task to wake people up to their essential humanity. I think that's going to be tough, and you might have to do some very extraordinary things. I mean, some very very radical things to make people look at themselves and look at the situation, you see? Because if you don't look at the situation, you can't change it, But you can change it if you look at the situation. And see, that's the greatest hope that I see among certain people, as they begin to look at the situation. That's revolutionary to me, for some people. Just look. Say, oh, yeah. That, to me, just look at it. But most people don't just, we are hedonistic people, trained to be, almost programmed, like tunnel vision. Can't think independently. You don't have autonomous ideas about anything. And see, the people are going to get us, and well, I'm going to tell you you don't have to be a prophet, to see this. Number one, I think that the American leadership of the nation is incapable of leading the American people. That's number one. They don't understand enough about the chemistry of these times. And even if they wanted to do anything, they couldn't do it. They're not creative enough. They don't have the mentality. The people in politics and the industrial military complex. You ought to read that article in Time on that thing about the military. I think that'd shake a lot of people up too, and see how powerful, how much influence the military has over their lives. So, might have some relationship to your going to school, sitting here right now. The military, just like the old days, they get powerful force. And of all people, look who mentioned it. He's given credit for it, Eisenhower. We know that Mr. Moose wrote the speech for him of talking about the industrial, the growing power and danger of the industrial military complex. When people understand, like most of what we're all about is geared to warfare. When people understand that, they don't even understand what they fear. And that's another thing. You get people, what do you fear? They don't know. Just anything. I scare people. The society is actually based on fear. I don't know, if you ask Brendan, what do you fear? He couldn't tell you. But it's somebody. It's the communists. It's the Negroes from Mississippi. It's somebody's grandmama, something. They scared. They can't, nothing. Just full of fear. And then they've been taught about this materialism, which is kind of an idolatry, that this is it. That everybody in the world wants this. I think that's going to be an interesting thing when human values surface. I mean, and there are people all over the world who have human values. Say this ain't what I want. You keep the 10 heat, you know, and all the cars and whatever you want. That ain't it. I'm going to learn to use things for the benefit of me, of human beings. Totally. And there are people all over this world who feel that way, you know, who are existentialists without even knowing it. And there are a number of people in this country who will know a little bit more about what it means to be human, and you can't wrap yourself up in things, you know. And we don't know where to stop, you see. This is why the society is incapable of producing any, at this point, any authentic culture. Can't do it. Everything has to be conceptualized. Nothing comes through life experience, you know. Fear. Nothing comes through concrete reality. This is very tragic for the American people. They're caught up in this bind between, you know, these people. And then you have a built-in immorality, if you will. Built-in criminality. Everybody knows that government is legal violence. We know that. You know, you talk, for instance, about the whole question of violence as a moral issue. It just didn't become a moral issue. And if you're talking about violence as an act, as a fact, along moral lines, then you're going to have to go far, a little further, stretch a little further than say what we call the riots, you know, which are kind of minuscule when you look at the totality of violence in this country that takes place every day without anybody throwing a brick. See, the only kind of violence the whites, for instance, can relate to is physical violence, not psychological violence. And most violence committed against human beings everywhere is psychological, you know, and that's pervasive in the society. Anytime you do damage to the human personality, that is violence. Whether it's a physical thing or whether you do it with words, that is a violent act to destroy the human personality. Now, I think we all know that individually, but it's not recognized, you see. And you don't call people sitting in Congress like the Eastlands and whatnot, who are really legitimate, who do legitimate violence, who are really criminals. In some other countries, we'd be asking for their heads, you know, these criminals, destroying people. Another thing, who are immorality, who are primarily responsible for the breakdown of law and order. There's no question about it. I think the men, primarily. And we talked about this, I think, about 6 or 7 years ago, about the impending disrespect for law based on talking about these men, saying how could finally a generation of people will arise who will deauthorize these people, who will not respect them, because they know what they are. See, now, white people can live with that, see, because of racism.
I don't think they can. I think they're intellectually insulted by this.
No, I don't mean that there aren't any people who are not opposed to this. But I think that most people just accept it as an American reality. You know, politicians are dirty, no good. You know, drink scotch and milk, cigars. You know, talk a certain way. It's dirty. It's built in, you know. So it's all right for that guy to commit crimes. You know, we only concerned about the criminal who's going to hit me in the head or snatch my pocketbook, you know. And he does the least damage to human life. That's a fact. No robber could do the damage to human beings that an Eastland could. It'd be impossible. In one stroke of the pen, he can destroy the lives of 15 or 20 children right now. Now, maybe they die, you know, at birth. See? And we don't see that, you know. But what is happening is that people have seen and you know, sit back and analyze people like that continuously being respected in the you know, most august body of the nation, and consider them, and they are no more than common criminals as far as I'm concerned, and they would be probably any other place, but nobody says anything.
No, yeah. I think you're so right. When I think back to living through the Joe McCarthy era,
yeah,
which was a terribly violent,
a misstep.
Yes, terribly violent time in America, where all of the basic human values affirmed in the Constitution were abrogated by the threat of McCarthy, and all built around this communistic issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was extremely violent. It wasn't physical, but
No.
it just tore people apart.
Yeah, scaring.
People apart. They couldn't live in their towns anymore.
Mm-hmm. 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 So that's a very crucial thing. Yes.
I think one of the things that you're talking about is that we think about people as functions. Even so, you talk about like the administration of the University of Minnesota or something like that, and fail to recognize that the administration is also talking about the administration, failing to recognize that they are personally responsible for what happens.
Right. It's abstract. Yeah.
And you get the people failing to recognize that these are individuals who can be gotten to and who are subject to all sorts of political and social and economic pressures. You talk about the workings of justice through the grand jury, the grand jury indictments or whatever it is, and you fail to recognize that justice isn't an abstract thing that operates in a vacuum. It's people making decisions about other people's lives and doing it illegitimately.
Another assumption about justice, about law anyway, that we think it has relationship to justice, that it necessarily has relationship to justice. I think people assume that. Like it's the law. Like that's all right. Yeah. We know that a great deal in human history has been done. Some of the greatest crimes in the world was done through law. I mean, legal apparatus. That's what the most violent institution in the history of the world was slavery. In this country. And it was all legal. See? Or something a little less violent, but certainly not that the people who were enduring it, segregation was legal. It's still with us. Hitler's Germany was legal. It was law. People, in recent times, people still insisted that law. You see, another thing about law is that it must have some relationship to culture. This is the only reason why I say Great Britain, for instance, were able to evolve into common law without a constitution. That's, the consistency of it. Now, this country had to superimpose this law over people, a very variegated people who really never understand the meaning of law, that it must grow, it must have some direct relationship to culture, it can't be just. You saw what happened during the liquor drinking period, where it just couldn't work. You had a society, a drinking society. I mean, this is a cultural custom. You can't take law and refute. Now, this is a real problem for black people, because there's no cognizance of their peculiar cultural development in law. And this is why even when a judge or whatnot, he's trying to be fair. He can't deal with it. He has no orientation into the cultural milieu, no appreciation, no understanding of. So even he can't be just because his frame of reference is wrong. You see, because there's one recognition of one culture in this country, and that is what is the dominant culture, which may not be the most profound, incidentally. In terms of what culture is, it's geared, to a lot of things like movies that are coming out of profound human experience, or the integrated life experience. American middle class culture does not come from the integrated human experience, not the one people who live in now. And the law. This is another word, law and order. That's a code word, all of a sudden, everybody's interested in law and order. Just recently. Now, we've been having killings and bombings and, ever since I've been in the world. I think ever since that one of the first pictures I ever seen was a man burning, And now everybody is interested in law and order. Now, what does that mean? See, this culture, what do you mean law and order? Who's law and who's order? How do you relate to that? How are you going to impose a law without understanding the culture of the people? It's an impossibility. And there are laws that couldn't be passed among white people like over black people. It couldn't be done because it goes against the grain of what that lifestyle is all about. Did you have?
I was just thinking more and more the need for talking about politics, for people who are in politics just to be in life, to know their own humanity and to be free in knowing their own humanity, to realize the humanity of others, and to do that they have to get out of the office more and more, just be with people.
That's kind of hard. I think there are some budding, a ray of hope among some young politicians who have young enough to have been humanized, who've been exposed to some humanizing experience, but there aren't that many, and it's going to be very difficult for people like that in a largely anti-humanist society to come up expressing human values, because human values are extremely radical. I mean, in this society, things like brotherhood and love, these are radical things, man. Dangerous. You know, that's right. Anybody come talking about brotherhood and love is in trouble. You know, we ought to call a moratorium on both of those words, because it's dangerous. That's a threatening, frightening thing to people. You know, and you know, with that old value says you got to be a tough and a go-getter and a competitor and a, you know, runner over and, you know, whatever. Sneaker up on her, you know, just do it. That's the kind of guy you got to be. And this is a value. I think that human values are on the rise. You know, I think that some people are beginning to understand the meaning of life in a higher plane. That the fact is that America has been a success in one sense, but there has to be higher levels of human consciousness than the one we are now. There's got to be. You know, I believe that. You know, if for no other reason of what has happened in my short life about, you know, the things that I've seen that I said I would never do, that I've done, that I said I would never do. You know, I would never get it right. You see, you see new things and you learn new ways to do things, and you become much more human and a better person for it. Being human is not an easy job. See, that's another thing. Folks just think, yeah, that's automatically human. About it, I think we're born with the potential. If you don't acquire human characteristics, you're not going to be human.
Well, your message is terribly religious. It's the kind of but it's the kind of theology that I think needs to be really affirmed in the world over and over again. Needs to be heard.
Let me say this about religion. I think that there are possibly more Christians, and I'm in a serious way, walking the streets right now than ever. I don't mean Pauline Christianity. I'm talking about Jesus, you know, the radical thing. You know, before it was an organization, when it was a movement. I see them every day. I think there's a secular church out there in the street. I don't think people can perceive of themselves and their acts as being Christian, but nevertheless they are. And they don't even go to church, and maybe that's why they're Christian. You know, but no, I think that there are hopeful signs. You know, there is no absolute. You know, like it's the marvelous and the terrible. You know, and there are things to look at very pessimistically, and some things, and pessimistic things do tend to dominate. You know, and you have to acknowledge that. That's reality. But I think there are some very hopeful signs. I think that in spite the chaos in which young people find themselves in, I think there's a good chance for them really making a contribution to the world in the area of human values. I mean, this particular young generation, across the board, you know, I think they're fantastic people. It's just that it's so hard for them to be intelligible. You know, because I guess they live in a nonsensical, crazy society, you know, like it doesn't make sense and meaning to them, particularly when you get all these beautiful ideas pumped into your head, man, you see? And if you're a serious person about letting the word suit the action and the action suit the word, you're going to get in trouble. And this is precisely what has happened to some of the young children. You realize, look, let me show you what happened. I was looking at a paper that I wrote. I think I used to be a good one. I must have been in the 9th or 10th grade. Let's see. No, it was after I got to junior high school. And it was on the American Creed. And I couldn't believe I wrote it. Man, I was running it down. You know, all the beautiful things, you know, about America. Look at me, a black person, you know, in order to, you know, how beautiful and how good, and, you know, that Jeffersonian stuff, you know, had been pumped into my head. And, you know, what made me think about that, because I began to, you see, you like believe these as you grow older, and then you find out that it has no validity, it has no reality. You know, I was astounded because I had written it, and I couldn't imagine myself. It would be the direct opposite, see, of what I wrote. How beautiful and how great the country is, and how people have been able to come to the country and been able to. It's just fantastic. I'm two different people. I couldn't write that now, you know, because I consider myself a cultural critic. Number one, to criticize more than anything else. And even when I know something good, I won't say it. Yeah. So, we're learning. I don't know if I've said enough about this, and I know, about economics, maybe there's some other questions you want to raise. But the next institution we'll just scan would be religion, which would be very interesting.